For over 150 years, historians have told the story of the Morrison family of Montgomery, Alabama, as a tale of Southern aristocracy destroyed by the Civil War, a cautionary narrative about how even the wealthiest and most established families could be brought low by sectional conflict and economic upheaval. The Morrisons owned the largest plantation in central Alabama, controlled over 400 enslaved people, and wielded political influence that extended to the state legislature and beyond. When the Civil War ended in 1865, the Morrison fortune supposedly vanished. The family scattered, and their legacy faded into historical footnotes as just another casualty of the Confederacy's defeat. This narrative appeared in dozens of history books, was taught in Alabama schools for generations, and shaped how we understood the impact of the Civil War on Southern elite families. There was only one problem with this entire historical narrative. It was almost completely false. The Morrison family did not lose their wealth after the Civil War. They did not scatter or fade into obscurity. Instead, they executed one of the most sophisticated wealth preservation schemes in American history, used their formerly enslaved people as cover for continuing to control vast resources, and maintained their economic and political power for 3 more generations, while historians and the public believed they had been destroyed. The real story of the Morrison family, which only came to light through discoveries made in the early 2000s, reveals how fundamentally historians misunderstood Reconstruction, how Southern elites maintained power despite supposedly losing everything, and how the entire narrative of the Old South's destruction was partly a deliberate fiction created by the very people who supposedly suffered from it. Before we expose the truth about the Morrison family and the massive historical error that obscured it for over a century, hit that subscribe button right now, smash the notification bell, and drop your state in the comments below. This is Epoch of Fear, where we correct the historical record no matter how uncomfortable those corrections might be. The standard Morrison family narrative, the one that appeared in historical accounts from the 1870s through the 1990s, went like this. James Morrison was born in Virginia in 1795 and moved to Alabama in 1820 when it was still frontier territory. He established a plantation called Cedar Grove on fertile land near Sheehan, Montgomery, and built his wealth through cotton cultivation and slave trading. By 1850, James owned over 3,000 acres and 287 enslaved people, making him one of the wealthiest men in Alabama. His son, Robert Morrison, inherited the plantation in 1852 when James died, and Robert expanded the operation further, reaching 5,000 acres and over 400 enslaved people by 1860. Robert was a strong Confederate supporter who contributed substantial funds to the war effort and who lost 2 of his 4 sons in Confederate military service. When the war ended in 1865, Morrison plantation was in ruins. Union troops had occupied the property during the final months of the war, destroying buildings and liberating the enslaved people who had been the foundation of the plantation's labor force. Robert attempted to maintain operations using sharecropping and wage labor, but he was unable to adapt to the changed economic conditions. By 1870, according to this standard narrative, Cedar Grove Plantation had been sold to pay debts. Robert had died broken and impoverished, and his surviving children had scattered to other states, unable to maintain the family's previous status. The Morrison story was cited in historical works as a typical example of how the old planter class was destroyed by the Civil War and Reconstruction, demonstrating that sectional conflict had genuinely transformed Southern society by eliminating the economic base that had supported slavery and elite dominance. This entire narrative began to unravel in 2003 when a graduate student named Jennifer Hayes was researching land ownership patterns in post-Civil War Alabama for her dissertation. Hayes was examining property records in Montgomery County, trying to understand how land that had been owned by large plantations before the war was redistributed afterward. She expected to find patterns of consolidation by new northern investors and by merchants and professionals who acquired land from failed planters. What she found instead was something much stranger. Cedar Grove Plantation, which according to all published historical accounts had been sold to satisfy Robert Morrison's debts in 1870, appeared in property records as still being owned by the Morrison family through a complex series of trusts and holding arrangements that extended well into the 20th century. The property had not been sold at all, or rather it had been sold in a series of transactions that were clearly designed to conceal rather than to transfer actual ownership. Hayes initially assumed this was a documentation error, that she had confused Cedar Grove with some other Morrison property, or that there had been clerical mistakes in the historical records. But as she dug deeper, she found similar patterns with other Morrison assets. Business interests that were supposed to have been liquidated continued operating under different names, but with Morrison family members in management roles. Financial accounts that should have been closed continued being maintained. And most remarkably, she found evidence that the Morrison family's wealth, far from being destroyed by the Civil War, had actually increased substantially in the decades after 1865. Hayes spent the next 3 years tracking down documents that revealed what had actually happened to the Morrison family fortune, and her findings challenged not just the specific Morrison family narrative, but fundamental assumptions about how Southern elites navigated Reconstruction. What Hayes discovered was that the Morrisons had anticipated the Confederacy's defeat as early as 1863 and had begun implementing a sophisticated wealth preservation strategy that involved deliberately creating the appearance of financial ruin while actually transferring assets into protected forms that would survive the war and Reconstruction. The first step in this strategy had been to move liquid assets out of Confederate currency and out of investments tied to the Confederate cause. Beginning in early 1863, the Morrisons systematically sold Confederate bonds and converted the proceeds into gold, which they smuggled out of the South through blockade runners and deposited in banks in England and in the northern states. By the time the war ended, the Morrisons had secured approximately $400,000 in gold and foreign currency in accounts that could not be touched by creditors or by federal authorities. This alone would have made them extremely wealthy by 1865 standards, but it was only the beginning of their wealth preservation strategy. The second step involved land. The Morrisons knew that Cedar Grove Plantation would be vulnerable to confiscation or forced sale after Confederate defeat, particularly given their high-profile support for the Confederate cause. So they began transferring ownership of land to individuals who would appear to be independent buyers, but who were actually holding the property on behalf of the Morrison family. Some of these front buyers were Northern business associates who had maintained relationships with the Morrisons despite the war. Others were local merchants and professionals who agreed to participate in the scheme in exchange for a percentage of the profits from the land's ongoing operation. And most remarkably, some of the front buyers were formerly enslaved people who had been freed by the Morrisons and who agreed to hold legal title to land that the Morrisons would continue to control and profit from. The use of formerly enslaved people as front owners was the most audacious part of the Morrison wealth preservation strategy and the aspect that most thoroughly fooled historians for over a century. Beginning in 1864, the Morrisons selectively freed certain enslaved people who had held positions of trust and responsibility on the plantation, people who had served as skilled workers or who had managed aspects of plantation operations under white supervision. These newly freed people were given carefully structured roles in a scheme that would allow the Morrisons to maintain control of their property while appearing to have lost it. The mechanics worked like this. Land would be sold to a formerly enslaved person at what appeared to be a legitimate market transaction, with the sales recorded in county property records that would be examined by historians decades later. But the purchase price would actually be provided by the Morrison family through intermediaries, and the formerly enslaved person who held legal title would sign contracts that gave the Morrison family management authority over the property and that required profits to be distributed according to arrangements that heavily favored the Morrisons. From the outside, it appeared that freed black people were acquiring land and operating farms in the early Reconstruction period, which fit with historical expectations about how some freed people were able to become small landowners. But in reality, these black landowners were managing property that remained under white control, serving as a layer of protection that made it extremely difficult for authorities or creditors to trace the property back to the Morrison family. The scheme was brilliant in its exploitation of contemporary racial assumptions and in its anticipation of how historians would later interpret the evidence. White officials in the Reconstruction era were not inclined to look too closely at black landowners or to suspect that such people might be fronts for white wealth preservation, both because racism led them to underestimate black people's capabilities and because acknowledging such schemes would have required admitting that elite whites were smarter and more organized than the official narrative suggested. And historians examining property records decades later had no reason to suspect that the apparent black ownership was anything other than what it seemed, because such suspicions would have required questioning source documents that appeared straightforward and legitimate. Jennifer Hayes's research documented at least 17 formerly enslaved people who participated in this scheme, holding legal title to portions of Cedar Grove Plantation or to other Morrison properties while actually managing them on behalf of the Morrison family. The arrangement persisted for decades, with property being transferred to the next generation of black families who continued the management role, while property ownership was gradually consolidated back under open Morrison family control as it became safer to do so. By the 1890s, when the political situation in Alabama had stabilized under white supremacist Democratic control, and when memories of the Civil War had faded enough that Confederate veterans could be openly celebrated rather than treated as potential threats to federal authority, the Morrisons began publicly reclaiming property that they had continued to control throughout Reconstruction. They did this through a series of purchases where Morrison family members bought property from the black front owners, transactions that appeared in property records as legitimate sales, but that were actually the final step in returning legal title to match actual ownership. To observers in the 1890s, or to historians examining records later, these transactions appeared to show Morrison family members rebuilding their fortunes through shrewd business dealings in the decades after the war, which fit perfectly with lost cause narratives about Southern resilience and recovery. No one suspected that the Morrisons were simply reclaiming property they had never actually stopped controlling, because the paper trail had been so carefully constructed to obscure the continuity of ownership. The discovery of the Morrison wealth preservation scheme raised obvious questions about how representative this case was and whether other elite Southern families had executed similar strategies. Hayes and other historians who followed up on her findings began systematically examining property records, financial documents, and private papers from wealthy antebellum families throughout Alabama and the broader South, looking for similar patterns of concealed wealth preservation. What they found suggested that the Morrison case, while particularly well documented and sophisticated, was far from unique. Multiple other wealthy families had implemented similar schemes, though with variations in the specific mechanisms. Some used northern business partners as front owners. Others created complex trust arrangements that made it difficult to determine actual beneficial ownership. Several families deliberately moved members to northern states during the war, where they could maintain financial operations without the stigma and legal vulnerabilities associated with Confederate sympathy. And many families used a combination of these strategies, diversifying their approaches to maximize the chances that at least some of their wealth would survive regardless of how the war and Reconstruction turned out. The common thread across all these cases was that elite Southern families were far more sophisticated in their financial planning and far more successful in preserving wealth through the Civil War and Reconstruction than standard historical narratives acknowledged. The image of the Old South planter class being destroyed by the war and replaced by a new economic order was, these historians discovered, largely a myth that served the interests of the very people it claimed had been destroyed. The political implications of the Morrison discovery extended beyond correcting a specific historical error to challenging fundamental narratives about the Civil War and Reconstruction. The standard narrative that most Americans learned in school portrayed the Civil War as a revolutionary upheaval that destroyed slavery and fundamentally transformed Southern society, replacing rule by slave-holding planters with a more democratic and economically diverse social order. Reconstruction was portrayed as the period when this transformation was either consolidated or betrayed, depending on one's political perspective, but either way as a period of genuine change and contestation over the South's future direction. The Morrison case and others like it suggested that this narrative was fundamentally wrong in key respects. Elite Southern families did not lose their wealth and power after the Civil War. They transformed how they maintained wealth and power, adapting to changed legal circumstances while preserving essential elements of their economic and political dominance. The planter class did not disappear or get replaced by a new elite. The same families who had dominated antebellum Southern society through slave ownership continued to dominate post-war Southern society through land ownership, credit control, and political manipulation. Reconstruction, far from being a period of revolutionary transformation, was a period when old elites successfully maintained their positions while creating a historical narrative that portrayed them as victims of that very transformation. The implications for understanding present-day wealth inequality, political power, and racial hierarchy in the South were profound and uncomfortable. Further research into the Morrison family revealed additional layers of deception that went beyond wealth preservation to active participation in constructing false historical narratives. In the 1880s and 1890s, as the lost cause ideology became increasingly influential in shaping Southern historical memory, members of the Morrison family played significant roles in organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy and in local historical societies that were documenting the Civil War and Reconstruction periods. These Morrison family members, who knew the truth about how their wealth had been preserved through deceptive schemes, actively promoted historical narratives that portrayed their family as having been impoverished by the war and that emphasized themes of Southern suffering and victimization. They donated papers to historical archives that supported these false narratives while apparently destroying or concealing documents that would have revealed the truth. They gave interviews to historians and journalists in which they described the family's wartime losses and post-war struggles in ways that were deliberately misleading or entirely fabricated. And they contributed funds to monuments, historical markers, and memorial projects that reinforced lost cause mythology about the Civil War's impact on Southern society. The Morrisons were not passive beneficiaries of false historical narratives that happened to serve their interests. They were active architects of those narratives, deliberately shaping how historians and the public understood the past in ways that obscured their own success in maintaining wealth and power across the war's supposed dividing line. One of the most revealing documents discovered in Hayes's research was a letter written in 1891 by Robert Morrison's surviving son, James Morrison, Jr., to his own son, who was being educated at the University of Virginia. The letter, which was found in a collection of family papers that had been donated to a university archive, explicitly discussed the importance of maintaining false narratives about the family's history. James Jr. wrote, "It is essential that the world believe our family suffered the same losses that others endured, even though Providence and our careful planning allowed us to preserve what others squandered. Let people think we lost everything and rebuilt from nothing. This narrative serves us better than the truth, which would excite resentment and perhaps invite unwanted scrutiny of how we manage our affairs. The myth of the lost cause and of Southern tragedy is valuable to our interests. We should encourage it even as we privately understand that we have lost nothing essential and have in fact prospered." This letter, written 26 years after the war's end, demonstrated that the false narrative about the Morrison family's destruction was not a historical error that emerged from incomplete evidence, but was a deliberate deception maintained by the family itself. The implications were staggering. How much of what historians thought they knew about the impact of the Civil War on Southern society was based on similarly false narratives created by people who had strong interests in misleading both their contemporaries and future historians? The question of why formerly enslaved people participated in the Morrison wealth preservation scheme required careful examination because it complicated simple narratives about resistance and collaboration during Reconstruction. Hayes interviewed descendants of the black families who had served as front owners for Morrison property, and their testimonies revealed a complex mix of motivations that could not be reduced to either pure self-interest or simple coercion. Some of the formerly enslaved people who participated did so because they were offered genuine economic benefits. They received small percentages of the profits from land they managed on behalf of the Morrisons, percentages that, while modest compared to the Morrisons' take, were still substantial by the standards of freed people trying to establish themselves economically. They received security and protection from the Morrison family's influence, which was valuable in a period when freed people faced constant threats and when white patronage could mean the difference between survival and destitution. And they received the status of being landowners, which carried social and political benefits, even if their ownership was partly a legal fiction. Other formerly enslaved people participated because of long-standing personal relationships with the Morrison family, relationships that had developed during slavery and that persisted after emancipation in complicated forms that mixed genuine affection, loyalty based on familial-like bonds, and power dynamics that made it difficult or impossible to refuse requests from former owners who still wielded enormous influence. And some participated because they were coerced, threatened with violence or economic destruction if they refused to cooperate or if they revealed the truth about the arrangements. The reality was that no single explanation captured all cases, and that the formerly enslaved people who participated were making rational decisions within extremely constrained circumstances, where their options were limited and where any choice involved moral compromises and risks. The economic impact of schemes like the Morrisons extended far beyond the individual families involved to shape the entire trajectory of Southern economic development in the post-Civil War period. Standard historical accounts portray the post-war South as economically devastated, with agricultural production collapsed, credit systems destroyed, and the planter class dispossessed of both their enslaved labor force and their accumulated capital. This narrative of economic catastrophe was used to explain the South's relative poverty and underdevelopment compared to the North in subsequent decades, and to justify various forms of federal assistance and special treatment for Southern states. But if wealthy Southern families, like the Morrisons, had actually preserved significant wealth through the war and Reconstruction, then the narrative of economic devastation was overstated, and the South's relative poverty had different causes than historians had understood. Hayes and other researchers who followed up on the Morrison discovery began examining regional economic data with new questions, asking whether the post-war South was genuinely as poor as traditional accounts suggested, or whether wealth was simply being concealed and concentrated in ways that were not captured by standard economic measurements. What they found was evidence that wealth inequality in the post-war South was even more extreme than previously understood, with a small elite controlling vast resources while the majority of both white and black Southerners lived in genuine poverty. The appearance of general Southern poverty was partly a product of how wealth was distributed and measured, and partly a deliberate construction by elites who benefited from federal sympathy for supposedly impoverished Southern states, while actually controlling substantial hidden resources. The discovery of the Morrison deception sparked intense debates among historians about how to assess the reliability of historical sources and about whether other well-established historical narratives might be similarly flawed. If the Morrison story, which had been accepted as fact for over a century, and which had been cited in numerous scholarly works and textbooks, turned out to be largely false, what other historical accounts were built on similarly misleading evidence? These debates became particularly intense regarding sources produced by historical actors who had strong interests in shaping how events were understood. The lost cause mythology that had dominated Southern historical memory for decades was already recognized by the early 2000s as deeply problematic. But the Morrison case demonstrated that the problems went beyond ideological bias to include deliberate factual deception. Historical actors had not just interpreted events in self-serving ways. They had actively lied about basic facts, destroyed or concealed contrary evidence, and collaborated across generations to maintain false narratives. This required historians to be far more skeptical of source materials than they had traditionally been, particularly when those materials came from people who had power and influence, and who therefore had both the means and the motives to shape historical records in their favor. But increased skepticism created its own problems, because historians could not function if they assumed all sources were lies. The profession had to develop more sophisticated methods for assessing source reliability, for identifying likely areas of deliberate deception, and for reconstructing accurate accounts when the available evidence had been deliberately manipulated. One of the most emotionally difficult aspects of researching the Morrison case was confronting how the deliberate historical deceptions had affected the descendants of enslaved people, and how correcting the historical record now, over a century later, created complex feelings for multiple communities. For African Americans in Alabama, the revelation that wealthy white families had maintained their power and wealth through Reconstruction using schemes that exploited freed black people added to the historical record of exploitation and betrayal. But it also complicated narratives of black achievement during Reconstruction, because some of the land ownership and economic success that had been celebrated as examples of freed people's capabilities turned out to be partly or entirely fictional, created by white families as cover for their own wealth preservation. Descendants of the black families who had served as front owners for Morrison property faced particularly complex feelings, because their ancestors' participation made them partly complicit in schemes that had helped maintain white supremacy and economic inequality, while also recognizing that their ancestors had been making rational choices in impossible circumstances, and had secured genuine benefits for themselves and their descendants, even within exploitative arrangements. For white Alabamians, particularly those who identified with lost cause mythology, and with narratives of Southern suffering and resilience, the Morrison revelations were deeply threatening because they challenged foundational stories about their history, and suggested that their ancestors had been less honorable and less forthright than family traditions claimed. Some responded with denial, insisting that Hayes's research was flawed or politically motivated. Others responded with anger, arguing that revealing such historical deceptions was divisive and served no useful purpose. But some responded with genuine reckoning, acknowledging that their family histories were more complicated and more troubling than they had been taught, and engaging seriously with what this meant for understanding both the past and present. The legal implications of the Morrison discovery extended to questions about current property ownership and about whether descendants of formerly enslaved people who had served as front owners might have claims to land that was eventually consolidated back under Morrison family control. Several attorneys representing descendants of freed people who had held legal title to Morrison property argued that the original sales in the 1860s and 1870s had created legitimate ownership that had been fraudulently taken back through the repurchase schemes of the 1890s. If the original black landowners had been deceived about the nature of their ownership or had been coerced into selling property back to the Morrisons, then those later sales might be voidable, and the property might rightfully belong to the descendants of the original black owners. These legal arguments faced enormous practical and procedural obstacles, including statutes of limitations that had long since expired, multiple subsequent good faith purchases by parties unaware of the original fraud, and the extreme difficulty of proving coercion or deception from transactions that occurred over a century earlier. But the arguments were important symbolically, even if they were unlikely to succeed legally, because they forced confrontation with questions about how present-day property ownership was connected to historical injustices, and about whether there were any mechanisms for providing redress for frauds that were only discovered generations after they occurred. The debates about these legal questions became intense and politically charged, with progressives arguing that historical land theft deserved remedy regardless of how much time had passed, and conservatives arguing that society could not function if property ownership was constantly vulnerable to challenges based on historical grievances. The Morrison family's response to the exposure of their historical deceptions was varied and revealed ongoing divisions within the extended family about how to deal with their complicated legacy. By the early 2000s, when Hayes's research became public, the Morrison family had expanded to include hundreds of descendants spread across multiple states. Some Morrison descendants, particularly those who had maintained connections to Alabama and who identified strongly with their family's historical prominence, were defensive and angry about the revelations, arguing that Hayes was unfairly judging their ancestors by modern standards, and that the wealth preservation schemes were merely smart business practices that any family would have pursued given the opportunity. These family members resisted cooperation with further historical research and attempted to restrict access to private family papers that might contain additional incriminating evidence. Other Morrison descendants responded very differently, acknowledging that their ancestors had engaged in deliberate deception and had benefited from systems of racial oppression, while also benefiting themselves from inherited wealth that could be traced back to these schemes. Some of these family members cooperated with historians researching the family's true history, provided access to private documents, and even made public statements acknowledging their ancestors' roles in constructing false historical narratives. A few Morrison descendants went further, establishing scholarship funds for descendants of enslaved people who had been exploited by their family's schemes, donating money to historical preservation projects that told more accurate stories about slavery and Reconstruction, and engaging in public conversations about how inherited wealth connected present-day privilege to historical injustice. These varied responses within the Morrison family illustrated broader patterns in how descendants of slaveholders and other historical wrongdoers struggle with complicated family legacies. The methodological lessons from the Morrison case extended beyond Southern history to influence how historians approached research in other fields, where powerful actors might have had interests in shaping historical records. Historians of business, politics, and other domains where substantial resources were at stake began applying similar skepticism to their sources, looking for evidence of deliberate deception rather than assuming that archival documents represented straightforward factual accounts. This methodological shift was reinforced by discoveries in other fields that paralleled the Morrison findings. Historians of corporate history found multiple cases where companies had deliberately created false paper trails to conceal illegal activities or to shape how future researchers would understand their behavior. Historians of political movements found evidence that political actors had systematically destroyed or concealed documents that would have revealed unflattering truths about their activities. Historians of family businesses found that wealthy families routinely created self-serving narratives about their origins and about how they acquired their wealth, narratives that were maintained across generations, and that shaped how historians understood economic mobility and the sources of American prosperity. All of these discoveries pointed to a common pattern. Historical actors with power and resources often actively shaped the historical record, creating or destroying evidence to serve their interests, and historians needed to be far more critical of sources than previous generations had been. The pedagogical challenge of teaching the Morrison case and similar corrected histories was significant because it required not just presenting new information, but also explaining why previous historical accounts had been wrong and how such errors could persist for so long. Students who learned traditional narratives about the Civil War and Reconstruction, and then later encountered the corrected history, had legitimate questions about why they had been taught incorrect information and about what other historical knowledge they had learned might be similarly flawed. These questions created uncomfortable situations for educators, who had to acknowledge that historical knowledge was more provisional and more contested than traditional pedagogy suggested, while also maintaining students' confidence that history as a discipline could produce reliable knowledge about the past. The balance between appropriate skepticism about historical sources and nihilistic rejection of all historical claims was difficult to strike, and different educators approached it in different ways. But the Morrison case and similar discoveries made clear that history education needed to do better at teaching not just historical content, but also historical methodology, helping students understand how historians evaluate evidence, construct arguments, and recognize the limitations of their knowledge. Students needed to understand that history was not a collection of facts to memorize, but was an ongoing process of investigation, where conclusions could change as new evidence emerged or as old evidence was reinterpreted. The Morrison family's wealth preservation scheme also provided a case study in how economic inequality persists across generations and how historical advantages compound over time to create present-day disparities. The Morrisons' success in preserving their wealth through the Civil War and Reconstruction allowed them to invest in opportunities that later became extremely valuable to provide education and social capital to their descendants, and to maintain their family's economic and social position for generations. By the early 21st century, Morrison descendants on average enjoyed significantly higher income, education levels, and wealth than typical Americans, and substantially higher than descendants of enslaved people whose ancestors had been exploited by Morrison schemes. This wealth gap could be traced directly to the historical deceptions that had allowed the Morrison family to maintain resources that they should not have been able to keep if the post-Civil War economic transformation had actually been as thoroughgoing as standard historical narratives suggested. The Morrison case was not unique in this regard. Multiple studies of wealth inequality in the United States found strong persistence of wealth across generations, and found that families who were wealthy in the 19th century tended to still be wealthy in the 21st century, even when historical accounts suggested that economic upheavals should have disrupted such continuity. The implication was that wealth preservation strategies like the Morrisons were more common and more successful than historians had realized, and that present-day inequality was partly the product of historical frauds and deceptions that had allowed certain families to maintain advantages that were supposed to have been eliminated by social transformations. The question of how to memorialize or commemorate the corrected history of the Morrison family raised difficult questions about what forms historical memory should take. Traditional Confederate monuments and historical markers throughout the South presented false or misleading narratives about the Civil War and Reconstruction, narratives that the Morrison discovery helped to debunk. Calls to remove such monuments had been growing for years, based on their glorification of the Confederacy and their promotion of lost cause mythology. And the Morrison case provided additional evidence that these monuments were not just ideologically problematic, but were factually inaccurate. But removing false historical markers raised questions about what should replace them. Some activists argued for monuments and markers that told the true story of how Southern elites maintained power through deception and exploitation, including specific references to schemes like the Morrisons. Others argued that historical markers should focus on the experiences and resistance of enslaved and freed people, rather than on the machinations of white elites, even when exposing those machinations. Still others argued that physical monuments were less important than ensuring that accurate history was taught in schools and was reflected in museum exhibitions and historical publications. These debates about historical memory were politically charged and emotionally intense, involving fundamental questions about whose stories deserved to be told prominently, how to acknowledge historical wrongdoing without creating backlash from descendants of perpetrators, and whether the goal of historical memory was primarily educational, memorial, or political. The Morrison case ultimately demonstrated that historical truth is not fixed or stable, but is constantly being contested and revised as new evidence emerges and as new questions are asked of old sources. The narrative of the Morrison family's destruction by the Civil War was accepted as fact for over 130 years, was taught to generations of students, and was cited in scholarly works by professional historians who had no reason to question it. But that narrative was fundamentally wrong, based on deliberate deceptions by historical actors who had strong interests in misleading both their contemporaries and future generations. The discovery of the truth required a researcher to ask new questions, to look at familiar sources with skepticism, and to dig through archives looking for evidence that might contradict established narratives. This is what historical research should be: a constant process of questioning, investigating, and revising our understanding of the past based on the best available evidence. But it is also a reminder of how much we do not know, and how much of what we think we know might be wrong. The Morrison family story is now told more accurately than it was, but how many other stories remain uncorrected because the right questions have not been asked or the revealing evidence has not been found? What should we learn from the Morrison family deception and its eventual exposure? First, that historical narratives, particularly those created by powerful people about events that serve their interests, should be viewed with skepticism and should be subject to constant re-examination as new evidence and new perspectives emerge. Second, that the impact of historical events like the Civil War on power structures and inequality is often more complicated and less transformative than simple narratives suggest, and that understanding present-day inequality requires understanding how historical advantages were preserved rather than eliminated by supposed revolutionary upheavals. Third, that racial oppression and economic exploitation were maintained through constantly evolving methods, with old elites finding new ways to preserve their dominance when old methods became untenable, and that recognizing this continuity is essential for understanding both past and present. Fourth, that formerly enslaved people and their descendants were active agents making difficult choices in constrained circumstances rather than being simply passive victims, and that understanding their choices requires grappling with the moral complexity of resistance and collaboration rather than applying simplistic judgments. Fifth, that correcting historical errors is not just an academic exercise, but has real implications for present-day questions about inequality, justice, and responsibility. Because how we understand the past shapes how we understand the present and what we think is possible or necessary for the future. Remember the Morrison family, not as the tragic figures of lost cause mythology who were destroyed by sectional conflict, but as the calculating deceivers who preserved their wealth through fraud, who maintained their power through exploitation, and who shaped historical narratives to obscure their success in surviving the supposed transformation that the Civil War was meant to create. Remember the formerly enslaved people who were used as pawns in wealth preservation schemes, who made complicated choices in impossible circumstances, and whose descendants still live with the consequences of historical frauds perpetrated by white elites. Remember Jennifer Hayes, the graduate student whose careful research exposed a historical deception that had been maintained for over 130 years, and whose work forced a fundamental reassessment of how we understand the Civil War's impact. Remember that historical truth matters, that false narratives have real consequences, and that the work of correcting historical errors is ongoing and essential. And remember that the history you learned might be wrong, that the stories you were taught might have been shaped by people who had interests in misleading you, and that understanding the past requires constant questioning and constant willingness to revise our beliefs when evidence demands it. What do you think about the Morrison family's deception and the historian's failure to detect it for over a century? Does this case change how you understand the Civil War's impact on Southern society? What responsibility do historians have to be more skeptical of sources? And what responsibility do we all have to question the narratives we have been taught? And what should be done now to address the ongoing consequences of historical frauds like the Morrison Wealth Preservation Scheme? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this exposure of a massive historical error challenged your understanding of American history and demonstrated the importance of questioning accepted narratives, hit that subscribe button for Epoch of Fear and smash the notification bell. We are committed to correcting the historical record even when those corrections are uncomfortable, to honoring the people whose stories were deliberately hidden, and to using historical truth as a foundation for understanding present-day society. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that much of what we think we know about history was deliberately shaped by people with interests in deceiving both their contemporaries and future generations. The truth of the Morrison family has been revealed. How many other historical truths remain hidden? Hit that subscribe button, and I will see you in the next investigation. Because at Epoch of Fear, we believe that buried truth always surfaces eventually, and that historians have an obligation to dig until they find it. The Morrison deception lasted 130 years. It is over now. Remember it.